In the territory now known as Canada in the early 20th century, thousands of workers in logging camps, mines, docks, fields and railroads joined the Industrial Workers of the World Union. They organised themselves, fighting for better pay and conditions, and trying to build a new, free and fair society in the shell of the old. This is working class history.
Fellow workers, pay attention to what I'm gonna mention, for it is the clear contention of the workers of the world that we should all be ready, true-hearted, brave and steady, to rally around the standard when that red flag is unfurled. Where the Fraser River flows, each fellow worker knows they've bullied and oppressed us, but still our union grows. And we're gonna find a way, boys, shorter hours and better pay, boys, and we're gonna win the day, boys, where the Fraser River flows.
Hi, and welcome back to the Working Class History Podcast. Before we get started, just a reminder that our podcast is only made possible by support from you, our listeners, on Patreon. Depending on your level of support, patrons get early access to episodes, exclusive bonus episodes, as well as free and discounted books, calendars, and more. Learn more and sign up at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. Today we're continuing our intermittent podcast series on the history of the Revolutionary Union, the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, or Wobblies. You can listen to this episode as a standalone, but if you want to be better acquainted with basic aspects of the union and basic concepts, we'd recommend going back and listening to our episode 6, in which we introduce the union and tell its early history in the US where it was formed. After the US, Canada was one of the countries where the IWW and its radical ideas had the most impact. We're very happy to be joined by Mark Leier, a historian, author and member of the union.
I am currently a professor of history at Simon Fraser University, and I've done some work and research on the IWW. I became interested in the IWW when I was working at different kinds of jobs. I did some of the jobs that IWW members had done historically, worked as a laborer in construction, for example. And reading about the IWW, especially when I ran into conflicts with trade unions who were clearly building unions on that business union model the IWW hated. So trying to organize a print shop that I worked in, went to the printers union, and they said, there just aren't enough people here to make this cost effective for us to mount an organizing drive. That got me interested in the IWW. And when I finally decided to go to university, I thought, I want to study Wobblies. Of course, their music and poetry also captivated me. They made such a huge cultural contribution to the working class. And so partly because I went to university originally to become a teacher, I thought I could combine the folk music, the songs, and the politics, but ended up becoming a graduate student and finally became a professor doing this work. So I've been a member of the IWW off and on. If any delegates are listening, I think I owe you some dues right now. But first signed up in 1976 here in Vancouver, British Columbia.
As we discuss in our episode 6, the IWW was formed in Chicago in 1905, and Canadian workers took part in its genesis.
Canadians were at the founding convention of the IWW, and it's a bit ironic talking about Canadian Wobblies because at that convention, the Canadian delegates made it very clear that they were uninterested in national boundaries and borders. In fact, it was John Reardon and a couple of others from Canada who insisted that they be called the Industrial Workers of the World. Some of the delegates said, called ourselves the Industrial Workers of the World, but let's be honest, there's 250 of us here in a hall in Chicago. Maybe we want to just not be quite so grandiose, call ourselves the Industrial Workers of America. And that's when the Canadian Wobs got up and said, nope, we insist that it's Industrial Workers of the World because national boundaries are part of the problem. So we refuse to limit ourselves in those kinds of ways. So they helped bring that internationalism that the IWW is so rightfully famous for right to that founding convention. And they had traveled from Montreal. Textile workers and miners from British Columbia went all the way to Chicago in 1905 for that founding convention. So they were there right at the very beginning. So the Canadian delegates from the West were deeply involved in mining. They had been members of the American Labor Union, which was a precursor to the IWW.
The first Canadian Wobblies had been involved in a union called the Western Federation of Miners, which joined the IWW en masse at its founding convention. When they returned to British Columbia, they continued to organise miners in the province.
They also were quick to organize workers in industries such as longshoring. And here in Vancouver, they helped to organize a group of First Nations longshoremen, a group that became colloquially known as the Bows and Arrows. And these are First Nation workers who traveled across the Burrard Inlet to work on the Vancouver docks. They had had their own organizations before, but the IWW's commitment to radical and democratic and militant unionism really appealed to them.
In 1906, 50 to 60 Indigenous longshore workers, who were mostly Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh, formed Local 526 of the IWW, the first union on the Vancouver waterfront. This local later became known as the Bows and Arrows. Canada at that time was still a British colonial dominion. Vancouver itself is in unceded Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh territory, and the city was rapidly expanding further into Indigenous lands. And as capitalist industry grew, colonial authorities ramped up restrictions on native fishing and hunting, as well as on Indigenous peoples' access to land and water. Waterfront employers tried to ensure that dock workers were divided on racial grounds, with non-Indigenous workers given preferential jobs. Like other IWW locals, the Bows and Arrows tried to organise across racial lines and organise all workers together to fight against the employers. Members of the Bows and Arrows also fought for the rights of First Nations peoples.
One of the members of the Bows and Arrows used the better wages that they had managed to collect for working on the waterfront to help fund a trip to London to put the case for First Nations to the British Parliament and to make that presence known.
The delegation to England, which met with King Edward VII to discuss settling land claims in British Columbia, was led by Sarpluk, also known as Chief Joe Capilano, who was a Squamish leader and had been a stevedore.
That connection between the IWW and First Nations is a really profound one. Not so much in terms of the actual ideology of the IWW, but the fact that the Wobblies made it possible for people to win dignity, win better wages on their jobs, and use those to further their political agendas in other spheres as well.
That said, the union didn't specifically have a critique of colonialism and advocate for Indigenous peoples as such. Rather, as with many revolutionary organisations at that time, they had kind of a colourblind approach, which advocated all workers organising together as a class against the employers, without specifically recognising that different sections of the working class had very different conditions and problems. In addition to miners and dockers, the IWW also organised among construction workers.
They organized civic workers, but because lots of construction being done in the province was paid for by municipalities. They're building railway lines, they're building streetcar lines, putting in sewage, building all that infrastructure. And so the navvies, the so-called unskilled pick and shovel workers that they hired, were also organized by the IWW. They engaged in a big strike up in Prince Rupert, engaged in organizing in other cities such as Vancouver and Victoria on Vancouver Island.
Municipal workers building roads in Prince Rupert in the north of British Columbia had formed the Prince Rupert Industrial Association, a union which joined the IWW. Road building paid better than railway construction, but workers had to pay for room and board near the work site, which was expensive in frontier towns. They organised a short strike in 1911 which won better pay for municipal workers. After this, they demanded equal pay for private contractors working on municipal contracts. The contractors refused, and this triggered a bitter strike. The Royal Canadian Navy sent a cruiser to the town. Police and replacement or scab workers clashed violently with the strikers, and eventually numerous strikers, including key organisers, were arrested and charged with serious crimes like riot, assault and attempted murder. Many of them spent months in temporary prison bullpens, which had been hastily constructed by workers in American Federation of Labour, or AFL, unions. While the second strike was unsuccessful in achieving its goals, it showed that, quote, unskilled workers, many of them from non-English speaking immigrant backgrounds, could organise themselves and take action. It also helped bolster IWW arguments that conventional unions and the AFL were part of the problem. Now, in terms of those workers actually being unskilled, as in most cases when this term is used, it's actually highly inaccurate and divisive.
It takes a great deal of skill, and they worked under very tough conditions. If you've ever been in Vancouver or Prince Rupert in the winter, and frankly, the fall and even the spring isn't so great either. You're working in mud, you're working in pouring rain. It's a rainforest in much of the province here. They're working 10 and 12 hours a day and often paid much less than the so-called skilled workers. And again, I say so-called skilled workers because I don't believe there is such a big distinction as we sometimes like to make. That distinction helps the boss, because he can pay the so-called unskilled workers much less. And that was something that the IWW fought directly and consistently in the province. So they organized navvies working on railways. They organized civic workers working on infrastructure. They organized miners and loggers. Often they could not win job control in these sectors, but they were a huge influence. They gave people a militant spirit. They gave them institutions, such as newspapers and halls where they could go engage in political action and activities, as well as leisure activities. So they were a profound influence across the province and in other provinces, especially Ontario.
By job control here, Mark's referring to basically a high level of control of the workplace by the union or the workers. So, for example, in some places, the IWW was successful in establishing control over hiring. So, say if employers needed to take on more people, they'd have to bring in IWW members through union hiring halls. As in the United States, the IWW in Canada didn't just pay lip service to its name. It really did its best to organise workers from all over the world.
One of the things that the IWW did and did very well in this province was to organize workers who did not have English as their first language. In fact, in an early organizing drive on the waterfront in Vancouver, the organizer boasted that we've signed up workers who speak 18 different languages in this local, everything from First Nations to Slavic languages and everything in between. Many of the skilled unions were also pretty racist and pretty sexist. We're not interested in organizing workers, as one wobbly put it, that had too many vowels in their last name. So they really broke down those barriers, made it clear that you could organize so-called unskilled, so-called immigrant workers. The IWW was also treated badly by the mainstream or the bourgeois press, and we should not be one bit surprised by that. They used all kinds of racist tropes to describe the IWW membership. One editorial in a Vancouver newspaper referred to the IWW workers as WAPs, W-A-P. I've never seen the word used anywhere else, but they said, look, by the WAP, we mean the worker speaking mother-forgotten tongues, engaging in noxious practices in camps and in the cities. They come from places from far away, the Slav, the Rus, the others. The only reason we hire them is that they're not Chinese.
As a small aside, we found that the term WAP was used in a couple of other places, like a 1912 book about Italian organised crime in New York. So it seems likely that it was an earlier form of the derogatory term WOP, W-O-P, used for Italians, and often wrongly thought to originate from an acronym, without papers. Anyway, the press was unsurprisingly unsympathetic to these migrant, quote, unskilled workers.
Could not understand why they might complain at working 12 hours a day for half the wages that they might work if they were, say, carpenters. And of course, this is what the mainstream press, the corporate press, always does. They never want to say capitalism is a really lousy system unless you're at the top of it. They always want to turn it back on the so-called outside agitators. They want to complain that these workers should be grateful for the lousy jobs that they have. And that's an very old tactic that they use and, of course, still use today. The sad part is the IWW was often painted the same way by the labor and socialist press as well, because lots of the trade union leaders wanted more than anything to be respectable. They wanted to be seen as good middle-class citizens of the province, of the country, of the city. They wanted to run for the Parks Board. They wanted to run for municipal office. And socialists, too, saw that the IWW's direct action was a threat to their electoral politics. And so the IWW press was always being attacked precisely for being what they were. That is, itinerant workers, hobos, rather than good, responsible, respectable citizens.
We talk about this in much more detail in our episode 6, but for anyone who wasn't aware, the IWW opposed political parties and elections, and instead advocated self-organisation and direct action by the working class ourselves. This made them an enemy of some of those on the left, particularly those seeking to represent the working class and act supposedly on our behalf within capitalist power structures.
And they did not advocate voting. And partly it was a very practical matter. Because they were itinerant workers, because they were transient workers, they rarely met the residency requirements and rarely had the vote. But also they had a critique of the state and said that empowering politicians to do what you can't do yourself is not the way to freedom. That workers, if we are going to ever own the means of production, to create that commonwealth of toil, we need to practice. That means we need to do this work ourselves. And if we cannot put economic pressure on the boss, how do you expect the government, which is mostly elected and made up of the business community, to do that work for us? So they advocated direct action up to and including sabotage, by which they meant everything from actually damaging equipment to what they call the conscious withdrawal of efficiency. This is just very similar to tactics that were done in the United States. And I think the fact that it happens here reminds us that the IWW and its ideas were not bounded by geography. This was about class and class divisions, not borders, not geography.
The industrial workers of the world, as suggested by their name, also wanted to organise all workers across each industry, like transport, for example. This was unlike most conventional unions at the time, which sought to represent smaller groups of skilled craft workers within each industry. So instead of transport workers as a whole, they would seek to organise railway engineers, conductors and firemen, etc. all separately, as well as separate craft unions for different kinds of workers on buses, trams, shipping and so on.
I think the most important tactic that the Wobblies used was they simply organized. And that may not sound like much, but this was really contrary to many American Federation of Labor craft unions who really functioned by keeping people out of the union. That is, they wanted to create a kind of artificial scarcity of labor so they could charge more for it. So simply organizing in constituencies that were abandoned by the traditional trade union movement was a pretty radical step for them to take. The IWW organized regardless of race and color and gender. They printed publications in several languages, and they actually went into the logging camps and the railway construction camps and the mining camps as workers. They worked there, and they talked to the workers beside them. They passed out leaflets and papers, and they plastered up silent agitators, that is, stickers with union messages. Many years ago, I guess in the 1970s, I had a chance to talk with a man named Alex Ferguson, better known as One-Armed Fergie, who had been an IWW member in the 1920s. And he talked about the kind of organizing that he did. And he would, as I talked about earlier, would work in the camps and would come down to the cities when the work had dried up. And he made a point when he was going back to camps in the spring to first stop by some of the religious crusaders in town, like the Salvation Army and others. And he would grab lots of their leaflets and put them in his pack. But what he would do would be to slip the IWW materials inside the religious pamphlets. So when he got to camp, they would search his pack and they would go through it and they would find all of these religious pamphlets and they would say, well, he's harmless. He's a religious nut, but that's okay. And as One-Armed Fergie put it, so I threw out that stuff, pulled out the good wobbly stuff and got to work.
In general, there are a lot of similarities between the early history of the IWW in Canada and in the United States, particularly in terms of its organisation of itinerant workers and in its struggles for free speech and the right to organise.
Many of the Wobblies that they organized were itinerant workers, hobos, tramps. They might be called bums. You know, the distinction has often been that a hobo is a worker who travels and works. A tramp is someone who travels and dreams. A bum is someone who travels and drinks. Well, the IWW were absolutely in that hobo camp, organized transient workers. They would organize in the camps, and I say they would organize in the cities where these workers would come when there was no work. They would come down and they would apply for jobs through the job agencies, the job sharks as they were called, and they would organize there. And that led to one of the biggest struggles the Wobblies organized in British Columbia, indeed in Canada, which was a free speech fight in 1912. Wobblies here, as elsewhere, did much of their organizing on street corners. So you might find the Salvation Army banging away on their drum on one corner, and the IWW and other socialists organizing with speeches and their own music on the other corner, each trying to drown each other out, I presume. And in Vancouver, Oppenheimer Park was one of the big places for this kind of street organizing. And Oppenheimer Park is still today often the site of homeless camps. But in 1912, as the IWW was organizing in the late winter and early spring, the city of Vancouver decided to ban speaking on the streets. It was a very limited ban. By that I mean the IWW and the Socialist Party were shut down, but the Salvation Army was allowed to continue, which put the lie to the city authorities' argument that they were worried that all of the noise would frighten the horses in the streets and cause real problems. And as the IWW pointed out, right, our speech is going to drive the horses crazy, but that idiot on the tuba with the Salvation Army, that's not a problem, So it was very clearly an attempt to shut down unions and to shut down organizing and to shut down the syndicalism and socialism of these movements. The IWW responded the way they did in many cities across North America. They didn't file a petition. They did not phone up their member of parliament. They sent out a call for all footloose Wobblies to come to Vancouver with the express purpose of standing up in the park, making a speech, and getting arrested to fill the jails. And the strategy was that at a certain point, the city would realize that they were having to house and bed and feed these people at a huge cost. It would be cheaper and more effective for them to simply restore speaking in the street. And after several weeks, that's exactly what happened. And the IWW won the battle for free speech in Vancouver. And this, again, was not a defense of some notion of natural rights. It was a defense of unionization and the ability to seize the streets and use them for political organizing.
One area where there is a real lack of historical documentary evidence is about women workers in the Canadian IWW. So unfortunately, only fragments have been uncovered so far.
One is a woman named Edith Frenette, who was organizing along with her husband in logging camps in British Columbia, around Port Alberni and other places. Pretty tough, rough conditions. Small towns, company towns, and out in bush camps. And Edith Frenette must have been a pretty amazing character. She had been a good friend of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, that U.S. listeners will know of, who was a spokesperson. She was the rebel girl that Joe Hill wrote a song about. And it comes to Canada and is organizing along with her husband. And at one organizing meeting, the right wing in the town was about to storm the podium where Edith's husband was speaking, and she pushed her husband off, jumped on the soapbox herself, and said, "Oh, all you big strong men, let's see how you can wrestle with a woman." So using that gender and that notions of respectability to organize, to shame the right wing and to continue organizing. And Frenette and her husband had a baby, Stella, who became the youngest member ever of the IWW. I think she was about 3 months old when they signed her up. And some people, a woman named Heather Meyer in the States, has done a bit of work to try to find more about Edith Frenette, but not much exists in terms of records.
We actually speak with Heather about Edith Frenette in our episode 19, about women in the early IWW, mostly in the US.
It's a problem of the historical record that every labor historian bumps into. Particularly, it's the case with women organizers and in Canada. The IWW in Canada sent lots of its, sort of records and its dues and its membership, to the United States, right, as part of an international organization headquartered there, which means that when those records were destroyed, the Canadian records also went with them.
Huge amounts of IWW documentation was seized by the US government in raids which took place around the country during World War I, which was then systematically destroyed.
We don't know much of IWW organizing in places such as fish canneries. We haven't seen any evidence of it. In part, these were very difficult places for anyone to organize. They were pretty much owned by companies. They were very small places up and down the coastline of British Columbia. Much of the work you'd think would be the perfect place for the IWW to organize. That is, it was work done by First Nations, by Japanese and Chinese workers, and especially by women workers. But we just do not have much evidence of them working there. They did do a lot of support work, however. So there were strikes of cannery workers in 1913 in the province, and the IWW was there giving support. And that's part of what they did as well, part of that influence they had. Even if they could not organize a workplace themselves, they were quick to build support. They sent money, for example, to the U.S. strike, so the Lawrence strike, a strike of mostly female textile workers. Locals in British Columbia raised and sent money to them. There was certainly less of an industrial women's workforce in British Columbia. Now, in places like Toronto and Montreal, you do find textile industries, and we do find agricultural work and tobacco work, and many women worked in there as well. As I've said, women did work in canneries, fish canneries here in British Columbia, and Wobbly supported fishers and cannery workers in their strikes. They were also keen to organize women in Ontario, but they especially organized them in what we would later call, that is later in the 1930s and 40s, into so-called women's auxiliaries. That is, in communities where women may not be engaged so much in wage work, but were married or were with men who did work. They organized women's auxiliaries to support workers, especially the Finnish communities that were supporting loggers and logging strikes here. And while we think that the term women's auxiliary is kind of derogatory and implies women did not have agency, everyone at the time was very clear that without that fundamental work that women were doing in those communities, the strikes, the organizing could not have been successful.
In its early days, as well as organising and fighting for free speech, the IWW also organised strikes. One of the most significant of these was the strike of railway navvies in 1912, and in this dispute the IWW again made the most of its international nature.
When they went on strike on the railway lines in British Columbia in 1912, they created what they called a 1,000-mile picket line, not along the length of the railway, but to go to other centers where scabs were being recruited. So they sent workers down to Vancouver, down to Seattle, down to San Francisco to say, don't come to British Columbia. The bosses are promising you everything. They're lying. There's a strike going on. That was one of the ways that they organized in very different forms from the AFL. They held open-air meetings. As I've said, they had sessions at their halls. They would invite speakers.
In addition to just going on strike, as Wobblies like to do, they also employed novel forms of direct action.
One of the most interesting and tantalizing, because there's just not a lot of evidence about it, examples of the direct action was during the 1912 railway strikes on the Grand Trunk Pacific and the Canadian Northern lines, because they organized workers spoke many, many different languages to pull them out. And they were protesting in part poor wages and terrible conditions, but particularly the conditions in the construction camps themselves. The camps were rotten. There's no better word for it, I suppose. Even a government health inspector just said the conditions here are terrible. In one of the camps, the camp cook has to draw water immediately downstream from the outhouse that's perched over the creek. Right? So it gives you some idea of how little employers cared for this. Well, if you go on strike to protest your living conditions, you've got a problem, because it means you're going to be spending a lot more time in those terrible camps that you're protesting. And so the IWW pulled its people off the job, some 8,000 of them, up and down several hundred miles of track, and they built their own camps. They knew how to do it. They were skilled workers that could use axes and saws and build proper camps. The first thing that the contractors for the railway did was to call for government health inspectors to shut them down. The health inspectors came and said, these meet all of our safety and health requirements, and they're much better than the camps that they left. So that didn't work. They also then had the job of keeping people on strike and in camps without having the whole thing fall apart. And so they organized what one reporter called miniature socialist republics. That is, they set up small communities at each of these camps. They would elect tribunals in order to pass and then enforce regulations, things like, no fighting, for example. And the judges on the tribunals would change regularly. So if you were accused of fighting, there would be a trial, and then you might be sentenced to getting 5 big armloads of wood to help with the camp cook, that kind of thing. So they organized songs, they organized educational meetings. So they really did build for several weeks these miniature socialist republics as a way to keep the strike going, to keep people alive. They also won a great deal of support in some of these areas from merchants, because the merchants would love IWW members to come into their stores, their restaurants, and purchase from them. So in fact, what we see then is an interesting kind of alliance between small proprietors against big capital and with workers. And I think that's an important strategy and tactics that we need to think about these days as well. When the health authorities replied that the camps were, in fact, much better than the camps the bosses had put together, the employers then used the power of the state. They had the police to come in to shut down the camps, and the police themselves used goons. They called them special constables that they used to harass workers and to arrest them. They arrested over 250 IWW strikers and organizers and put them into small prisons and cells and bullpens built especially to house them. They were given sentences of 2 and 3, 6 months in jail. One IWW member went blind from the terrible conditions in the prison in Kamloops. That's how the strike was eventually broken. The camps were smashed and broken up. Workers were arrested. The workers, however, did win some concessions. There wasn't a complete loss. And as one IWW remembered many years later, it's difficult to say when you've lost a strike, because Rosa Luxemburg pointed out, workers are going to lose every battle until the last one. What matters are the lessons that we learn from the actions that we take. And in that sense, the strike, I think, was a huge success, even if they did not win everything that they had wanted. And by that, I mean they had proved conclusively that so-called unskilled workers, immigrant workers, could be organized and could take radical action. And in that way, this was a big rebuke to the conservative trade unions who said, you can't do it. You cannot organize these people, and you can't organize women either. It's impossible. So it was a big fuck you, if you'll pardon my language, to that conservative trade unionism. And they proved that radical and militant and democratic unionism could work.
Rosa Luxemburg, mentioned just there, was a socialist who took part in the German Revolution in 1918, who was eventually murdered by the right-wing paramilitary Free Corps, acting on behalf of the Social Democratic government. As well as organised strikes themselves, the IWW also helped support workers taking action elsewhere.
The Fraser River strike of the railway construction workers, or navvies, was the biggest and probably the most profound IWW effort in the province, but it was by no means the only one. They worked as activists in other unions and in unorganized workplaces. So they were very active on Vancouver Island, helping coal mine strikes there. And the largest strike lasted 2 years, from 1912 to 1914. And the IWW influences all over that strike, from the speeches, the rousing speeches, from organizing mass protests to have arrested miners sprung from jail.
In addition to organising on the job and taking direct action, the IWW tried to really foster and grow a working class counterculture and sense of worker solidarity in all aspects of life.
One of the most important things the IWW did, although perhaps organizers at the time would not have thought so much of it, was to organize and develop countercultural activities. Joe Hill, for example, is going to be well known to listeners. He came up to Canada, to British Columbia in 1912 during a strike of railway navvies, and he wrote a song called Where the Fraser River Flows. Not quite as popular, perhaps, as some of the better-known songs. There's No Solidarity Forever, for example, written in British Columbia, but Where the Fraser River Flows is still sung on picket lines here. Richard Brazier, another a well-known wobbly songwriter, said that he first actually heard miners and IWW songs in Cobalt, Ontario in 1906 when he was working up there. When he came back to the United States, he then developed his own style and his own songs here.
One night as I lay dreaming, this vision came to me. I saw an army streaming, singing of liberty. I marked these toilers passing by, I listened to their cry. It was a triumphant anthem, an anthem filled with joy. It was a triumphant anthem, an anthem filled with joy. One union, industrial union, workers of the world unite to make us free from slavery and give every man his rights.
The IWW has continued in Canada to play a role in terms of culture. I'm not sure how popular or how well known this expression is in the United States, but one of the synonyms for a wildcat strike in British Columbia is a wobble. So workers will talk about, we're going to wobble the job tomorrow. And this is a direct derivation from the IWW and their nickname, the Wobblies. And at least according to folk etymology, the very nickname Wobbly came from an IWW strike in British Columbia. Folk singers such as Utah Phillips continued to come up here up in the 70s and 80s and 90s. I was signed up in the IWW in 1976 by a wobbly named Al Grierson, who was a musician, died about 20 years ago, I guess, in Texas. Tom Wayman is a BC poet, a longtime wobbly, who continues to write about work and the need for us to explore that, since so many of us spend most of our days and most of our lives at work. So that IWW cultural connection still exists today.
One event which had a huge impact on the IWW was the beginning of World War I. Because of Canada's relationship with Britain, it entered the war much earlier than the US.
Canada entered the war in 1914. The United States didn't enter World War I until 1917, which meant that in Canada, the wartime conditions made it much harder for anybody to organize. The patriotism of a lot of those Anglo trade union workers also meant that they responded with a great deal of patriotic fervor to Britain and Canada going to war. And so the first years of World War I in Canada see the labor movement turn on itself, saying, we are patriotic British and we are patriotic Canadians and we support the war effort. That also made it very difficult for the IWW to organize. Many of the workers that would be the traditional constituency of the IWW, Finns, Ukrainians, were declared illegal aliens in Canada because they had come from places that Canada was now at war with, or they were rounded up precisely because they had been radicals and militants before the war. So that repression starts much earlier in Canada than it does in the United States. But, as I've said, that did not end the IWW. They are still able to pull off significant strikes in the 1920s in Canada and the United States. One of the reasons the IWW was not successful in organizing against the war, or in fact even during the war, first government repression, as I've said, both of radical unions and of the immigrant workers, ethnic workers that were a huge part of the IWW constituency. But shortly before the war, the resource sector of Canada hit a depression. This was in fact part of a worldwide depression, but countries that are largely working in resource industries such as mining and logging tend to be hit hard and hit early on those things, which meant that many of the jobs simply disappeared. And with them, so did the IWW's workers. So we see the Victoria branch, for example, shutting down just because the membership just isn't there. They're looking for work in other parts of the continent. So that too made it difficult for them to have a coherent strategy for either organizing or for resisting the war. What is really fascinating, though, is that the working class movement in Canada, as it did in the United States, got better as the war progressed. That is, after that initial wave of patriotism that blinded many of the Anglo leaders of the more conservative trade union movement, the conditions of the war, the horrible slaughter, and the terrible economic conditions at home made workers turn to new ideas, new strategies, new tactics. And when they started to look around for those, of course, the ideas of the IWW were already there waiting for them. And in particular, workers in Canada turned to the general strike in 1918 and 1919 by war's end. I see it as workers saying, old crazy Joe there, he's talking about the general strike. He's been nattering on about it since 1905, blah, blah, blah. But now in 1918, Crazy Joe makes sense, that workers now see the necessity for new kinds of solidarity, for new kinds of tactics. And we have a strike wave that literally rolls across Canada from Nova Scotia to British Columbia. Every province has a general strike lasting sometimes just a few days, sometimes 6, 8, 10 weeks, in protest of the war, in protest of the economic conditions after the war, marked by very high inflation, and utter disgust with what they see as the senseless slaughter of the war, and workers now saying things like, we need to produce not for profit, but for need. So making those connections between capitalism and war, and taking to the streets to make that new sense of radicalism and militancy alive and vivid.
Much like the IWW in Australia, which we talk about in our episode 19, the Canadian IWW was banned on the 24th of September 1918, with membership punishable by a sentence of up to 5 years imprisonment in one of 24 internment camps.
As part of the wartime repression, the federal government outlawed the IWW. It also outlawed various so-called, ethnic institutions that were connected to radical politics in many cases. Again, the Ukrainians, for example, were put into internment camps during the war, even though they had literally no connection to events in the Ukraine. Many of them had been in Canada for 15 and 20 years. The Socialist Party of Canada was not banned. Interestingly enough, it tells us something about, I think, the respectability of many members of the Socialist Party of Canada, although it would be a mistake to think that there was a really sharp dividing line between the IWW and the Socialist Party. Some members moved back and forth. John Reardon, founding member of the IWW, run as a Socialist Party candidate here in Canada. But the Socialist Party was not the same kind of threat that the militancy and radicalism and rank-and-fileism of the IWW presented. The violent repression of the IWW in the United States does not have the same kinds of parallels in Canada. Canada sometimes refers to itself as, the peaceable dominion, and that's just not true. It is the case that the Canadian state does not have the same kinds of resources, or did not have the same kinds of resources available to the Americans. The obvious comparison is to the treatment of First Nations or Indigenous peoples in Canada. The Canadian government did not engage in a war of genocide, as happened in the United States against the Indigenous population. Instead, they used residential schools and starvation to commit a different kind of genocide. And one reason they did that, and they were quite upfront about this, is to say, look, the United States spends $20 million a year fighting Indians. Our entire federal budget is only $19 million. So if we're going to repress people, we need to do it on the cheap, which means we can't go to war. And that means that the violence looked very different, I think, on this side of the border, but not for any laudable or good reasons. And true of labor policies as well, although we often forget that over a 10-year period between about 1900 and 1911, on average, the militia was called out twice a year to put down strikes across Canada. They were not done at the level of, say, the Ludlow Massacre in Canada. But again, it's not because Canadian politicians are of any kind of better character or more refined disposition.
In Ludlow, miners and many of their children and wives were massacred by National Guardsmen during a strike at mines owned by the Rockefeller family. The strikers were demanding to be paid in money rather than company scrip, which was only redeemable at company stores. On top of the repression, other factors contributed to the decline of the IWW as an organising force.
The other thing that helps dilute the IWW influence, or at least move it, was the success of Lenin and the Bolsheviks in Russia and what would become the Soviet Union.
In March 1917, following a demonstration by women workers in St. Petersburg, workers in Russia launched a social revolution and overthrew the brutal Tsarist government. In November, revolutionaries, including the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the provisional government and set about reorganizing society based on workers' councils, or Soviets. These revolutions are known as the February and October revolutions. That's because Russia at the time used a different calendar.
It seemed for a time that somehow the Russians had done it right. And so the communist parties in Canada and the United States have a great deal of favorable feeling and sentiment from people. Now, the IWW in the States officially, did not join the Communist Party, but many organizers did. They saw the Communist Party as the movement that now had the same kind of momentum that the IWW had previously. And to be fair, the communists were organizing, or the communists / former IWW members were organizing in much the same way in the same industries that the IWW had been involved in. So in Canada, organizers such as Arthur Slim Evans, Sam Scarlett had been in the IWW. Slim Evans had been at Ludlow, Colorado, had been shot there. For them, it makes sense, at least for a time, to move to the Communist Party in the early 1920s through the 1930s. So that meant that the revolutionary momentum, if you like, was now being taken up by the Communist Party in the ways that the IWW had. And some good organizers moved over there. Others didn't, but they did not recover in quite the same way.
With the IWW outlawed, some of its activists and people who had been influenced by it founded a new union based on similar ideas.
One of the other events of 1919 in Canada is a new organization starts up, an organization called the One Big Union. This was clearly a riff on the IWW slogan of One Big Union. It was put together by socialists, that is, people who are more or less dedicated to some kind of electoral politics, and we can debate endlessly whether these were revolutionary or reformist electoral politics, but they also recognized the need for a trade union or an industrial union arm and for that kind of activity. So they do organize in 1919 before the largest of the general strikes in Canada, the Winnipeg General Strike. The IWW and the One Big Union had a very mixed relationship. Some members who at the IWW joined the One Big Union, thought this was the continuation of the IWW by other means. Others fought it. Others thought they are clearly just trying to capitalize on all of the work that we have done over the years, and were deeply concerned that the One Big Union organizers were really trying to create nice positions for themselves in the trade union movement and in the political structures after the war. So mixed feelings, mixed reactions to it. The OBU, no coincidence, was strongest in areas that had already been organized, or at least attempted to organize, by the IWW. So they're strong in mining and they're strong in the logging camps, where the seeds really had been sown, not to mix a metaphor, by the IWW. So they did pick up on much of the earlier work that they had done before the war and turned it into an organization after. But the OBU itself didn't do much, didn't have much of a history in Canada. It's more, I think, famous for what it tried to do than what it actually did. And where it was most successful, it looked more like the IWW than an independent organization of its own.
Despite its difficulties, the IWW did continue to organize in a number of places, and IWW members still kept organizing strikes.
The other interesting strike in terms of, kind of its historical importance was a couple of logging strikes that took place in 1924 in the Kootenay region, so the eastern part of the province near the Rocky Mountains. And I say it's an important strike because a lot of writers on the IWW, including myself in an early work, talk about the IWW as essentially being done by World War I. They just kind of faded away after that. And in the 1924 strike here proves that they didn't. And I'm very happy to say that other historians in the United States have made the same kinds of arguments, that in fact, the largest membership of the IWW was in 1924 as they're organizing farm workers in the United States. They also moved into other unions and kept that IWW influence, which I described briefly, I guess, as that commitment to a radical and militant and democratic union movement that has the ideals of a workers' commonwealth front and center. So that logging strike in 1924 was an explicitly IWW strike, and important essentially for the fact that it existed, proved that they could organize.
I did ask Mark how big the Canadian IWW was at its peak in terms of numbers, but for various reasons that's not really a question which is possible to answer specifically.
Yeah, one of the neat things about the IWW is that it grows and it shrinks according to circumstance, and it is there for people to turn to when conditions seem ripe. And so its influence always was greater than its membership. It always punched way above its weight. We could say that there were perhaps 8,000 workers during those railway strikes in British Columbia, but the IWW would often kind of bloom in places where no one would organize. The logging camps in the 1920s, the bows and arrows on the waterfront in 1906 in Vancouver, and would work as well and as long as they could. When conditions changed, as I've said, when the pre-war depression hits, the members move and the organization folds up until it becomes more useful for people to adopt those ideas and more likely that they will succeed with them. So that often sounds like we're hedging. Well, part of the fact is we just don't know how many members that there were. And there's even a discussion of what does it mean to be a member? As I've said at the very beginning, I've been delinquent in my dues for some time now, though I still hold the IWW principles in my heart. When I was more active in the IWW, our joke was, what makes a good wobbly? One who pays their dues on time. But if we look to the ideas, we see a much more significant influence of the IWW than the mere membership might expect. We also just don't know much about IWW membership because many of the records of the organization were seized and destroyed by the United States government during World War I and the 1919 Red Scare in Canada and the United States. So we are left with sometimes police reports that give us glimpses. And so the 1920s, we can see reports of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Mounties, saying, we've arrested wobbly organizers at the border, or we know there's an infiltration of IWW members here in Saskatchewan. How many? They don't say, right? So it's difficult to be very precise, and we get tantalizing clues. We can see IWW orders for newspapers. That is, we want to take the Industrial Worker and the other newspaper Solidarity into our camps. I need 1,000 copies of it. Does that mean they're giving them to 1,000 wobblies who have paid up and got their dues stamps? Probably not. It does mean that there's that influence and people interested in it. It's useful, I think, to think of the IWW not as a political party, paid up members, so much as a movement. Right? It does have that more institutional part that gives it a kind of consistency and a longevity and a focal point at different times, but its influence is much broader and wider. I mean, what does it mean when people today sing Solidarity Forever, a song written by a wobbly?
With the eclipse of the IWW as a significant force in the Canadian workers' movement, it still had a legacy which spread much further than its specific gains on various jobs. Now in a minute, Mark's going to use the terms pork choppers and pie cards. These refer to paid bureaucrats in mainstream trade unions.
I think that, in some ways that the most important impact of the IWW that we still see today was summed up by Joe Hill, who just before he was executed in the state of Utah said to the IWW, "Don't mourn, organize." And that message, I think, resonates so powerfully and is so important. I sometimes think in my own case, I need to say, don't whine, organize. It's easy to give up and just go, nah, and to remind ourselves that we need to solve our problems collectively through organization. And organization of the unorganized, of the misorganized, and especially among the neediest and most oppressed. The IWW is still a resounding rebuke to capitalism, to business unionism, to pork choppers and pie cards, and to reformists. And I think that message hasn't changed since 1905 and the opening words of the preamble of its constitution. The working class and the employing class have nothing in common. So in the early 1960s, Canadian workers are explicitly looking to bust out of the conservatism of the official trade union movement. One of the unions that they formed is called the Canadian Association of Industrial, Mechanical and Allied Workers here. And CAMA, as it's called, became a really dynamic and dramatic union that used wildcat strikes, that talked about left programs for Canadian workers. And again, many of its people absolutely created unions in the IWW mold as much as possible, given the increased bureaucratization of industrial relations in the post-war period. Other unions, too, adopted tactics, because many, even conservative unions, now had an awful lot of young militant workers in their ranks in the 1960s. And again, we tend to think of the 60s protests as something done by university students, and that is true to some extent. But equally important, in some ways perhaps more important, was that rank and file reaction to the conditions of the 1960s, of the alienation, of terrible work, of automation and unemployment. And that, again, often borrowed quite explicitly on the IWW and saw it as the sort of the roots of their own sensibilities and organization in the 60s and 70s. I mean, virtually every tactic we see in protests today, from mass rallies to boycotts to civil disobedience to sit-ins to sabotage, was pioneered and debated and refined by the IWW. And today's militants and activists are absolutely part of that tradition. But it is the addition of the class consciousness of the IWW that is so crucial. And I think we see people getting that message more and more. And that commitment to democracy, and by that I do not mean elections every 4 years to vote for Tweedledum or Tweedledummer, to pick the evil of two lessers, as someone put it, but democracy meaning real fundamental decision-making in communities and workplaces. That's the way to understand and defeat right-wing populism among working people and the right-wing mission of capitalism and the state. And the IWW is a long and really important part of that tradition of resistance. And that spirit, as well as any direct lessons we might want to pull out from it, I think speaks to something so deep and so profound, and that it is its ability to have articulated that more than 100 years ago, that is perhaps its most important living legacy.
As with most of the history about resistance and action of ordinary people, the history of the IWW in Canada still has a lot to be uncovered. In a moment, Mark mentions the name Bakunin. This is referring to Mikhail Bakunin, a pioneering Russian anarchist.
I'm really interested in trying to put together the story of John Reardon as an activist, ranges across the country. Much of his story just seems to have vanished from the historical record, but I'm trying to reconstruct as much as I can with that. I'm really excited to have some really smart and dedicated graduate students who are digging in all over the place, looking at IWW. So work really hard at staying out of their way and trying to help them continue this work. And the other project that I'm working on is looking at the labor movement in the 1920s here, when that right-wing labor movement, which is shut down so effectively by that strike wave of 1919, starts to resurface. And so I want to look at the active role that the labor movement and conservative factions in it played in helping to end that legacy, at least temporarily here. So that's part of what I'm doing. I did take some time off to write a biography of Bakunin, who I think has much in common with the IWW. I think he would have agreed with later anarchists such as Emma Goldman, who saw the IWW as being anarchists in overalls. So yeah, lots of projects like that. My original book on the IWW in British Columbia, where the Fraser River flows, is available at better bookstores nowhere these days. It was published, 1990, I want to say. That's a long time ago. But I'm delighted that people still write to me and tell me that it's had an impact on them. So it's not me, it's the IWW, of course. So telling that story and bringing the new tools that we have, both in terms of new questions and new technology to the history of the IWW, means that its story is just going to become better known, and we're going to know more and more about it over time.
We spoke more with Mark about John Reardon, who wrote IWW poetry. That's available in the bonus episode to this one. We also talk about Robert Gosden, an ultra-militant wobbly turned police spy, and we learn more about uses of wobbly tactics in later struggles. That's available exclusively for our Patreon supporters. You can support us and listen now at patreon.com/workingclasshistory, link in the show notes. If you can't support us right now, absolutely no worries, but if you could share our episodes with your friends, give us a 5-star review on your favourite podcast app, that would be very much appreciated. If you enjoyed this podcast, do check out the rest of our IWW series. In episode 6, we talk about the early history of the Union in the US. In episode 9, we talk about its later history in the US. In episode 16, we talk about women in the early IWW. In episode 19, we talk about the Australian IWW. And in the first episode of the Working Class Literature podcast, we talk about wobbly poet T-Bone Slim. We've also got a bunch of great books available about the IWW in our online store, so check them out, link in the show notes. And as a listener of our podcast, you can get 10% off your next order using the discount code WCHPodcast. As always, we've got more information, sources, links, and a transcript on the webpage for this episode, linked in the show notes. Thanks to our Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible, with special thanks to Connor Canazzi, Shay, James, and Ariel Joya. Music used in this episode was Where the River Fraser Flows by Joe Hill, performed by Mark Leier, who's at Mark_Leier on Twitter, and A Dream by Richard Brazier, performed by Charlie Kane, at CharlieXKane on Twitter. Links to both those socials in the show notes. You can also hear full versions of both of those songs in the bonus episode for our patrons. Thanks to Louise Barry for editing this episode. And finally, thanks to you for listening. Catch you next time.
They've bullied and oppressed us, but still our union grows. And we're gonna find a way, boys, shorter hours and better pay, boys, and we're gonna win the day, boys, where the Fraser River flows.